At one of America's most prestigious universities, an advanced calculus class was about to become the stage for an unexpected intellectual showdown. The professor, Dr. Linda Markham, was known not just for her brilliance in mathematics but also for her increasingly political approach to teaching. Over time, her lectures had evolved from purely mathematical discussions into platforms for promoting social justice narratives, often intertwining identity politics with academic rigor. While many students admired her intellect, others quietly resented how political ideology had begun overshadowing the subject they had enrolled to study. Among the students that day was Barron Trump, a quiet but undeniably brilliant young man. Despite his reserved nature, his reputation preceded him, his perfect test scores, his deep understanding of advanced mathematics, and, of course, his last name. Though he preferred to stay out of ideological debates, many whispered that his place in the university was a result of privilege rather than merit. Barron, however, remained unfazed, focusing solely on his academic pursuits. That morning, tension filled the air as students filed into the lecture hall. Instead of the usual complex equations on the whiteboard, a bold statement greeted them. Today's topic: redefining academic priorities. A few students exchanged puzzled glances, realizing this would not be a standard mathematics lecture. Dr. Markham stood at the front, an authoritative presence, her sharp gaze scanning the room. Without hesitation, she began her lecture, not on calculus, but on the need to shift the focus of education toward issues of social equity. As she spoke, her words became increasingly pointed, subtly implying that academic success was often the product of privilege rather than intelligence or hard work. Though no names were mentioned, it was clear that her comments were directed toward students like Barron. As the discussion veered further from mathematics, Barron, who had remained silent so far, calmly raised his hand. It was an action that would change the course of the lecture, and perhaps, the professor's career. Dr. Linda Markham continued her lecture, her voice carrying a tone of authority as she moved across the front of the classroom. Today, she wasn't just teaching calculus, she was making a statement. With each slide, she outlined how the traditional focus on pure mathematics was outdated, arguing that academia must embrace a more balanced curriculum, one that prioritized social justice alongside STEM education. Some students nodded in agreement, while others exchanged wary glances, unsure of how this related to the advanced calculus they had signed up for. Barron Trump, seated quietly in the back, observed the discussion unfold with a composed expression. He had always valued the purity of mathematics, the way it transcended political divisions and personal biases. But as Dr. Markham continued, it became clear that today's lecture had little to do with solving equations. The professor, sensing the room's mixed reactions, pressed on. "We must acknowledge," she declared, "that some students arrive at this institution with inherent advantages. Family wealth, private tutors, elite prep schools, all of these factors create an illusion of merit. In reality, many of you wouldn't be sitting here without the privileges granted by your last names." A few students chuckled under their breath, turning to glance at Barron. Others looked uncomfortable, recognizing the not-so-subtle implication. But Barron remained calm, his hand raising slowly. A hush fell over the room. Dr. Markham hesitated, as if debating whether to acknowledge him. Then, with a smirk, she gestured toward him. "Yes, Mr. Trump? Do you have something to add to our discussion about privilege?" Barron lowered his hand, his voice measured and respectful. "Professor, I believe mathematics is one of the few fields where merit is undeniable. Either you can solve an equation, or you can't. Wouldn't shifting focus away from pure mathematics ultimately disadvantage all students, regardless of background?" A few students nodded in agreement, but Dr. Markham's smile didn't waver. "Mathematics," she said, "is not as objective as you think. The systems that determine who excels and who struggles are deeply rooted in societal structures. Perhaps you, of all people, should reflect on that." Barron didn't flinch. "I agree that access to quality education should be equal," he replied. "But don't we do a disservice to students by lowering academic standards in the name of equity? Shouldn't we be striving to elevate everyone rather than diluting excellence?" Dr. Markham's eyes narrowed slightly. "Tell you what, Mr. Trump. Since you're so adamant about maintaining academic rigor, let's put that to the test." She turned to the whiteboard, grabbing a marker. The class watched as she rapidly wrote out a long, complex equation, a multivariable calculus problem that even graduate students would struggle with. Stepping back, she smirked. "Since you're so passionate about merit, let's see if you can solve this." The challenge was clear. Either Barron would fail in front of the entire class, proving her point, or he would succeed, and completely upend her authority. The room fell silent, every eye now on Barron. Without hesitation, he rose from his seat and walked calmly to the front. The next few minutes would determine far more than just a mathematical solution. Barron Trump stood at the front of the lecture hall, his eyes scanning the intricate equation Dr. Markham had scrawled across the whiteboard. The room was silent, the weight of the professor's challenge hanging in the air. She had intended to humiliate him, to make an example of him in front of the class, but Barron remained unfazed. He studied the equation for a moment before turning to face the room. Before solving it, he addressed the class in a calm, composed tone. "Professor Markham has given us a fascinating problem," he said, his voice steady. "And I'm happy to attempt a solution. But before I do, I want to address something more fundamental, what this challenge represents." A murmur rippled through the room. This wasn't the nervous stalling of a student out of his depth. There was a confidence in Barron's words, a quiet authority that made people lean forward in their seats. "We're here to study calculus," he continued, "a field built on the pursuit of logic, precision, and truth. Mathematics doesn't care about politics, privilege, or personal beliefs, it simply demands understanding. To suggest that certain students have an unfair advantage is to assume that intellect and discipline can be inherited rather than earned. But knowledge, true knowledge, must be pursued, not granted." Dr. Markham's smirk flickered for the first time. Barron wasn't flustered, nor was he reacting emotionally. He was turning the conversation back to the very essence of education itself. "Now," Barron said, "let's return to the problem at hand." He picked up the marker and, without hesitation, began working through the equation. His approach was methodical, each step written with clarity and precision. He explained as he went, referencing historical mathematical theories and demonstrating alternative methods to reach the solution. Rather than just proving his own ability, he was teaching, engaging the class in the very subject they had come to study. As the minutes passed, something remarkable happened. Students who had initially found the problem intimidating were beginning to understand it. A few even nodded along, captivated by Barron's logical breakdown of the solution. Dr. Markham's arms were crossed, but her expression was no longer as confident. She had expected Barron to falter, to hesitate. Instead, he was in complete control, not just of the equation, but of the room itself. When Barron finally reached the solution, he set the marker down and turned back to the class. "Mathematics," he said, "is one of the few remaining disciplines where effort and ability matter more than anything else. If we focus on division instead of discovery, we lose the very purpose of learning." A hush lingered before, one by one, students began to clap. Some started recording on their phones, recognizing that they had just witnessed something extraordinary. Dr. Markham cleared her throat, visibly uncomfortable with how the challenge had backfired. But before she could dismiss the class, a student raised their hand. "Professor," they asked, "can Barron explain that last step again? I think I finally understand it." Dr. Markham hesitated, realizing the moment had shifted beyond her control. Barron had not only met her challenge, he had redefined the entire conversation. As the tension in the lecture hall reached its peak, Barron Trump stood at the whiteboard, marker in hand, facing the challenge that Dr. Markham had set for him. The equation she had written was a complex, multivariable integration problem, one that would typically be tackled by graduate students, not undergraduates. She had designed it to be impossible for him, a public test meant to embarrass and expose what she saw as his privilege. But Barron, calm and collected, took a deep breath and began. His first step was unexpected. Instead of rushing into solving the equation, he turned to the class and spoke. "Before we begin, let's analyze this problem. Like any challenge in mathematics, there are multiple approaches to solving it. The key is recognizing the most efficient path." The room, initially silent with anticipation, now hummed with curiosity. Barron wasn't merely trying to solve the problem, he was turning it into a teaching moment. He pointed at the board. "We can approach this using traditional integration techniques, but there's a more elegant method developed by Euler in the 18th century that simplifies this equation significantly. Would you like to see both approaches?" Students exchanged glances, and a few even nodded. Some who had initially dismissed Barron as nothing more than a well-connected student now leaned forward, intrigued. Dr. Markham, arms crossed, narrowed her eyes. She had expected Barron to struggle, not to take control of the lesson. Barron turned back to the board and began working through the equation. His hand moved with precision, each step methodically written and explained. As he progressed, his explanations became more detailed, providing insights that even some of the more advanced students found enlightening. He referenced foundational mathematicians like Leibniz and Gauss, weaving historical context into his solution. Then, something unexpected happened. A student in the middle row hesitantly raised their hand. "Wait," they said. "I think I actually understand this now." Barron smiled. "Good. That's the goal of mathematics. It's not just about solving problems, but understanding the logic behind them. Dr. Markham's expression darkened. She had set this up as a battle, an intellectual humiliation. But Barron had transformed it into something else entirely, a moment of collaborative learning. With the final few strokes of his marker, Barron completed the equation in a fraction of the time it would have taken using conventional methods. He then turned to the class. And that, he said, is the power of understanding over memorization. When we prioritize learning, rather than ideology, we unlock knowledge that benefits everyone. The classroom was silent for a long moment before it erupted in spontaneous applause. Even students who had been indifferent to the challenge were now clapping, impressed by Barron's intellect, but more importantly, by his humility and ability to teach. Dr. Markham, meanwhile, stood stiffly, her earlier confidence shattered. What had started as an attempt to diminish Barron's credibility had instead solidified him as the most respected student in the room. And as she looked around at the faces of her students, many of whom had just learned more in 5 minutes from Barron than they had in weeks of her lectures, she realized she had made a critical miscalculation. Barron Trump hadn't just won the challenge. He had changed the entire dynamic of the class. As Barron Trump stood before the whiteboard, every eye in the room was locked onto him. The equation Dr. Markham had thrown at him was meant to be an insurmountable challenge, a public demonstration of his supposed privilege and unearned status. But instead of faltering, Barron had turned the situation into an opportunity, not just to prove his own capability, but to elevate the entire class's understanding of advanced mathematics. With the marker in hand, he calmly began his solution. Each stroke was precise, each calculation deliberate. He spoke as he worked, explaining his approach with a clarity that left students in awe. This equation, he said, at first glance appears to require brute force integration, which would be time-consuming and unnecessarily complex. However, if we apply Euler's formula in conjunction with a transformation method from Fourier analysis, we can simplify it significantly. A few students' eyes widened in recognition as they scrambled to take notes. Others, who had struggled with calculus before, found themselves nodding along, finally grasping a concept that had previously eluded them. Dr. Markham, standing with her arms crossed, had expected Barron to stumble, to expose himself as nothing more than a name with connections. Instead, he was delivering a masterclass in mathematical problem-solving. Now, we reduce this to a second-order differential equation, Barron continued, effortlessly maneuvering through advanced calculus with the confidence of a seasoned mathematician. By substituting an eigenvalue approach, we can express this in terms of a convergent series rather than attempting direct integration. A murmur of appreciation rippled through the class. Students exchanged glances, some in awe, others furiously taking notes, realizing they were witnessing something extraordinary. Dr. Markham's smirk had long since vanished. She had designed this test as a way to put Barron in his place. But instead, her own position in the classroom was rapidly shifting. Barron wasn't just solving the problem, he was teaching. And he was doing it better than she had. Then came the moment that truly turned the tide. As Barron reached the final steps, he paused. We have two possible solutions at this point, he said, turning to the class. One follows the standard method you've been taught, which would take another full board to complete. The other is an optimized approach derived from Leibniz's original techniques, reducing it to just 3 more steps. Would you prefer to see both? The class was silent for a beat, then a voice from the back spoke up. Can we see both? It was Sarah Chen, a student who had previously struggled with calculus but now looked genuinely engaged. Barron smiled. Of course. As he methodically walked them through both solutions, students leaned forward in their seats, captivated. Even those who had previously tuned out lectures were following along, realizing that this was more than just an academic exercise. It was a moment of pure intellectual discovery. When Barron finally placed the marker down, the equation solved in 2 separate ways, a stunned silence filled the room. Then, without prompting, the class erupted in applause. Even students who had never paid attention in math class before were clapping. Some pulled out their phones, not to check messages, but to record the moment. Dr. Markham looked pale. Her carefully curated authority over the classroom had crumbled. She had tried to undermine Barron, but instead, she had witnessed a level of intellectual mastery that left her speechless. Barron turned back to face her, his expression calm, without a hint of arrogance. The beauty of mathematics, he said, is that it doesn't discriminate. It doesn't care about politics, privilege, or background. It only cares about logic, precision, and truth. The weight of his words settled over the room like a revelation. The students who had once whispered about Barron's last name now saw him not as a legacy student, but as something much more, an undeniable genius who had just reshaped their understanding of mathematics in a single class session. And Dr. Markham? She had nothing left to say. As the applause settled and the murmurs of amazement filled the classroom, the door suddenly burst open. Standing in the doorway was Dean Richardson, a staunch advocate for Dr. Markham's progressive curriculum changes and a known supporter of her political ideology. His presence alone sent a ripple of tension through the room. "Linda," he announced, his tone authoritative. "We need you for an emergency faculty meeting regarding the proposed curriculum revisions." Dr. Markham, still reeling from what had just transpired, saw the interruption as a much-needed escape. She straightened her posture, adjusting her blazer as if regaining a semblance of control. "I'm afraid this discussion will have to be postponed," she declared, turning toward the class. "We have more pressing matters to attend to." But before she could take a step, Barron Trump spoke up, his voice steady and composed. "Professor," he said, his gaze unwavering. "You challenged me in front of this class. I accepted. Walking away now would teach an unfortunate lesson about academic integrity." A wave of murmurs spread across the classroom. Students who had once been passive observers now felt emboldened by Barron's quiet defiance. Even the dean hesitated, sensing that this situation was spiraling beyond his control. "Young man," Dean Richardson said, his voice laced with irritation. "You may have proven a point about mathematics, but this university is not just about equations. It's about fostering a balanced education that prepares students for real-world issues." Barron nodded, as if considering the argument, then responded with deliberate calm. "I completely agree, sir. But should we not also prepare students by teaching them to follow through on their commitments?" Professor Markham set this challenge as a test of merit. "I completed it. The real question now is whether she will uphold the values she claims to teach." The classroom fell into silence again. The dean's expression darkened, and Dr. Markham looked visibly trapped. This was supposed to be a moment of public humiliation for Barron, a lesson in the limits of privilege. Instead, it had become a lesson in intellectual honesty, one she could no longer control. Sensing that the tension was reaching a boiling point, Barron did something unexpected. He reached out, handing the marker back to Dr. Markham. "Perhaps," he said with a measured smile, "you would like to demonstrate your solution first. After all, knowledge, not status, should determine our credibility, correct?" Dr. Markham hesitated, her fingers wrapping around the marker as she stared at the complex equation on the board. The very equation she had selected to expose Barron had now become a challenge directed at her. The room waited in anticipation, students watching as the dynamic shifted in real time. The dean, sensing the precarious position his colleague was in, stepped forward. "This is neither the time nor place for grandstanding," he said firmly. "Academic settings should encourage discussion, not division." Barron tilted his head slightly. "I completely agree. And part of academic discussion includes facing challenges we set for others. Or are we suggesting that accountability only applies to students and not faculty?" A hushed gasp went through the classroom. The dean's jaw tightened. He was not accustomed to being questioned so directly, especially by a student. Meanwhile, Dr. Markham's grip on the marker tightened before she suddenly dropped it onto the desk, her shoulders tensing. "This is absurd," she snapped. "This entire display is nothing more than a privileged student trying to undermine my authority." The words hung in the air for a moment before Barron responded, his tone unshaken. "With all due respect, Professor, authority should be built on knowledge and integrity, not politics or personal bias." The classroom erupted in hushed conversation. A few students nodded in agreement. Others discreetly recorded the exchange, sensing that they were witnessing something that would ripple beyond this one lecture hall. Dean Richardson exhaled sharply, clearly realizing that there was no way to spin this into a win for Dr. Markham. Instead of escalating further, he turned toward her and said, "Linda, let's go. We have other matters to discuss." Dr. Markham hesitated, but ultimately turned and left the room with the dean, her exit feeling less like a retreat and more like an escape. As the door shut behind them, the class remained silent for a beat. Then, one by one, students started to clap again, not out of defiance, but out of appreciation for what had just unfolded. Barron took a slow breath, then turned back to the whiteboard. "Now," he said, "who wants to see how this equation applies to real-world physics?" With that, the lecture continued, not as a power struggle, but as a genuine exchange of knowledge. And at that moment, every student in that room realized they had just witnessed something much bigger than mathematics. Dr. Markham stood frozen, her face pale, her authority crumbling before the very students she had sought to impress. The silence in the room was deafening as Barron Trump's elegant dismantling of her challenge hung in the air. She had entered the classroom confident that she could use her position to reinforce her ideological stance, but now she found herself on the defensive, outmatched not just in intellect but in grace. She clenched her jaw, feeling the weight of every student's gaze upon her. The equation on the whiteboard, the one she had chosen to humiliate Barron, now loomed over her like a monument to her own miscalculation. And Barron, rather than gloating, simply stood there, his expression calm, waiting, not with arrogance, but with patience. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she took a breath and muttered, "I see you've certainly done your homework." Barron, sensing the opportunity to de-escalate, gave a polite nod. "Professor, my intent was never to embarrass you," he said sincerely. "Mathematics, at its core, is about seeking truth, not proving personal points. We all make mistakes, including myself. But the beauty of education is that we can learn from them." His words, delivered with poise and humility, sent a ripple through the class. A few students who had been watching with a mix of awe and discomfort exchanged glances, clearly impressed. Dr. Markham, on the other hand, felt the weight of what was happening. This young man, whom she had sought to make an example of, was now extending her an unexpected kindness. Dean Richardson, still standing in the doorway, cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. "Perhaps we should focus on the broader curriculum discussions at another time," he suggested, sensing that any further confrontation would only deepen the damage already done. But Barron wasn't finished. "Professor," he said, looking at Dr. Markham with measured respect, "I still believe that you have an incredible amount of knowledge to share with us. Your work in advanced calculus has been invaluable to many students, including myself. Perhaps we could refocus on the subject at hand and use this moment as a reminder of why we are all here, to learn." A murmur of agreement rippled through the classroom. Even students who had been skeptical of Barron at the beginning of the semester now found themselves drawn to his ability to lead without belittling others. His words weren't just an attempt to smooth things over, they were a demonstration of true intellectual integrity. Dr. Markham's lips pressed into a thin line. For years, she had been in complete control of her classroom, her authority unquestioned. Now, for the first time, she felt genuinely challenged, not by hostility, but by a student who had just shown more wisdom than most faculty members she knew. She exhaled sharply, forcing a nod. "Perhaps you're right," she admitted, though the words felt like stones in her mouth. Barron smiled, his victory not in humiliating her, but in restoring the purpose of education itself. "Great," he said, stepping back to his seat. "Now, I believe we were discussing the real-world applications of differential equations." The class, which had been so tense just moments ago, finally began to breathe again. Dr. Markham hesitated, then turned back to the board, the classroom now feeling less like her domain of ideological control and more like what it was always meant to be. A space for learning. And as the lesson resumed, it became clear to everyone in that room that Barron Trump had not just won an argument. He had reshaped the very dynamics of what it meant to be a leader in the world of academia. The impact of the confrontation between Barron Trump and Dr. Markham extended far beyond the walls of the lecture hall. What had begun as an attempt to assert political dominance over a student had turned into a defining moment, not just for the class, but for the entire university. Within hours, students who had witnessed the exchange firsthand began sharing their experiences on social media. Clips of Barron's mathematical mastery and his calm, articulate dismantling of Dr. Markham's argument spread like wildfire. Soon, the story was no longer just about a classroom dispute. It had become a nationwide debate on academic freedom, intellectual integrity, and the politicization of education. News outlets from both sides of the political spectrum picked up on the incident. Conservative commentators hailed Barron as a beacon of meritocracy, someone who had stood his ground against an agenda-driven professor and defended the purity of academic pursuit. Meanwhile, left-leaning media struggled to frame the event, with some arguing that Dr. Markham had merely sought to introduce a more inclusive approach to education, while others acknowledged that her behavior had crossed ethical lines. But it wasn't just the media that reacted. The university itself faced an unexpected wave of scrutiny. Alumni, donors, and even faculty members weighed in, with some demanding an internal review of how ideological biases were influencing classroom discussions. Administrators, caught in a firestorm they never anticipated, were forced to issue a statement reaffirming their commitment to academic excellence and intellectual diversity. Behind closed doors, faculty members debated whether this incident would set a precedent for greater accountability in teaching or simply embolden students to challenge professors at every turn. For Dr. Markham, the fallout was both personal and professional. While she retained her position, she found herself facing mounting pressure from students and colleagues alike. Enrollment in her courses dropped dramatically the following semester, as students sought out professors who prioritized subject matter expertise over ideological discourse. Meanwhile, some of her peers distanced themselves, unwilling to associate with a faculty member whose methods had been so publicly discredited. Barron, on the other hand, found himself in an unusual position. Though he had never sought the spotlight, his quiet determination and intellectual prowess had made him something of an academic celebrity. Invitations poured in for him to speak at student-led discussions on maintaining academic integrity and depoliticizing education. He politely declined most of them, preferring to focus on his studies, but his impact was undeniable. Even beyond the university, a broader conversation emerged. The incident forced educators nationwide to re-examine their own biases and approaches to teaching. Was academia truly a place for open discourse, or had it become an ideological battlefield? The question lingered, sparking heated debates in classrooms, faculty meetings, and even among policymakers. But for Barron, the real victory was never about fame or proving a point. It was about ensuring that students, regardless of background or belief, had the opportunity to learn in an environment where merit mattered more than politics. And in that, he had succeeded. The events that unfolded in Dr. Markham's classroom did not simply fade away with time, they became a pivotal moment in the university's history, leaving behind a lasting legacy in education. What started as a tense classroom confrontation evolved into a broader conversation about the role of politics in academia, the importance of intellectual freedom, and the value of true meritocracy. Barron Trump, once known primarily for his last name, had inadvertently become a symbol of academic excellence, proving that knowledge and skill should always take precedence over ideology. In the months following the incident, the university was forced to re-evaluate its curriculum and approach to academic discourse. Student organizations, once hesitant to challenge faculty bias, began advocating for more transparent teaching methods and a renewed focus on objective learning rather than ideological persuasion. The administration, keen to repair its image and demonstrate a commitment to intellectual rigor, implemented new policies encouraging balanced classroom discussions, where students felt safe to express differing viewpoints without fear of ridicule or academic penalty. Dr. Markham, who had built her career on blending activism with education, found herself at a crossroads. While she remained a faculty member, the respect and authority she once commanded had been diminished. More importantly, she was forced to confront the reality that her approach had alienated students rather than enlightened them. After much reflection, she made a quiet but profound shift in her teaching style. Rather than using her platform to push a specific ideology, she began focusing purely on mathematics, allowing the beauty of numbers and logic to stand on their own. Though she never publicly admitted her previous mistakes, those who took her courses in later years noticed a distinct change. A professor more invested in fostering genuine intellectual curiosity than in asserting political dominance. For Barron, the incident propelled him into an unexpected role, not just as a student, but as an advocate for fair and rigorous education. Though he never sought recognition, he became a quiet force within the academic world, mentoring students who had felt stifled by bias and encouraging open discussions grounded in reason rather than rhetoric. His ability to navigate intellectual challenges with grace and humility made him a respected figure among his peers, and his influence extended far beyond the university walls. But the most significant impact was on the next generation of students and educators. The story of Barron's calm defiance against Dr. Markham's challenge became a case study in classrooms across the country, inspiring a renewed emphasis on fostering genuine academic integrity. Professors, once confident in their unchecked authority, became more mindful of their biases, while students felt empowered to question narratives that seemed more ideological than educational. In the end, the confrontation between Barron and Dr. Markham was not just a clash between a professor and a student, it was a turning point in the ongoing struggle for academic fairness. It served as a reminder that true education is not about power or politics, but about the relentless pursuit of knowledge and the courage to stand up for what is right. And as long as students like Barron Trump continue to challenge the status quo with intellect and integrity, the future of academia would remain in capable hands. The story of Barron Trump's intellectual triumph over Dr. Markham is more than just an inspiring anecdote. It carries profound lessons that are highly relevant to the challenges we face in modern education and public discourse. In today's world, where ideological bias often infiltrates academic institutions and public conversations, Barron's calm, fact-based approach serves as a reminder that knowledge and critical thinking should always take precedence over personal agendas and political narratives. One of the most crucial takeaways from this story is the importance of standing up for intellectual integrity. In an age where cancel culture and ideological conformity pressure individuals to stay silent, Barron demonstrated that challenging authority with facts and logic, not hostility, can be a powerful tool for change. His composure, rather than aggression, made his arguments irrefutable and forced even those who initially opposed him to reconsider their stance. In real life, this lesson applies to students, professionals, and anyone who encounters bias in their environment. Rather than being intimidated by those who push narratives without evidence, we should strive to engage in discussions with clarity, confidence, and a commitment to truth. Another key lesson is the value of humility in both teaching and learning. Dr. Markham initially used her position to assert authority rather than to educate, assuming that her ideological perspective was more important than the subject she was meant to teach. This is an issue we often see in workplaces, media, and academia today, where authority figures sometimes let personal beliefs overshadow their responsibility to foster real growth and learning. However, her eventual willingness to acknowledge her mistake, even if reluctantly, underscores the importance of keeping an open mind. Whether we are in positions of leadership or learning, we must always be willing to challenge our own biases and accept when we are wrong. True wisdom comes not from clinging to a belief out of pride, but from recognizing the value of ongoing learning. Additionally, Barron's ability to navigate a difficult situation with grace rather than arrogance highlights the power of leading by example. Many people today are quick to react emotionally to perceived injustices, often resorting to outrage and personal attacks rather than thoughtful dialogue. Barron, however, chose a different path. He demonstrated his point not by attacking his professor, but by showcasing his knowledge and allowing his actions to speak for themselves. This approach is applicable in all areas of life. In professional environments, social debates, and even in personal relationships. Instead of resorting to confrontation, we should aim to influence others through our actions and capabilities, proving our worth through competence rather than rhetoric. Finally, the broader theme of meritocracy versus entitlement is one that remains central in many discussions today. Barron's experience reminds us that true excellence is earned, not granted. Regardless of background, privilege, or obstacles, those who dedicate themselves to mastering their craft will always stand out. In today's world, where shortcuts and entitlement sometimes replace hard work and perseverance, Barron's story serves as a reminder that discipline, knowledge, and resilience are the greatest tools for success. In applying these lessons to our daily lives, we should strive to maintain intellectual honesty, challenge misinformation with facts rather than emotions, and pursue personal excellence regardless of the challenges we face. By doing so, we not only elevate ourselves but also contribute to a culture that values truth, reason, and genuine merit.